today. Anyway, on the question of the F-16s, and before I leave this topic, I will just say that the Kremlin itself has had a number of things to say, and this was said by Peskov, Putin's spokesman, earlier today, and he said that it is clear that the supplies of various more advanced weapons and types of armament to Ukraine are spiraling up. Obviously, the decision has been made to send aircraft too, but just like all other types of weapons, this is unable to fundamentally change the situation on the front line. And he went on to say that it will have no effect on the special operation. In other words, the Russians will continue doing that which they have been doing for a year and a half now. They will not be deterred or intimidated, and if the West goes on sending more and more weapons into Ukraine, feeding more and more weapons into Ukraine, it will slow down the progress of the special military operation, but it will not in the end change the outcome. And I think this is correct. Well, all of this comes back to the question of who can sustain the war longest. And of course, Gideon Ratman had much to say about that, about Russian staying power. He says that the Russians are now dug in, and that inexperienced Ukrainian troops, this is Gideon Ratman again, may struggle to gain ground. The pessimists fear that if the war is still deadlocked next year, Putin may manage to mobilize hundreds of thousands of new troops for the next phase of the conflict. Although the Ukrainians have higher morale and better tactics, Russia has a larger pool of potential soldiers. The RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, by the way, is starting to do a whole series of analyses, I've noticed, on the conduct by the war of the Russian military. They seem to be concluding, on the contrary, that the Russians are adapting well and successfully to the war. And of course, to the extent that Ukraine had better trained troops at the beginning of the war, I'm not convinced that they were necessarily better trained than the Russian troops at any time, but never mind. But of course, many of those better trained troops have either been killed or wounded and are no longer part of Ukraine's force, and that has even been admitted in the West. So there we go. But Ratman then goes on to say that Ukrainian officials point out that unlike their Western backers, they will never have the luxury of walking away from the conflict. Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's foreign minister, likes to quote an adage attributed to John Lennon: everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. Can I just say that is a very bleak view? It appears to commit Ukraine to war without end and without hope, and I can't really see how that can work at all well for Ukraine. And of course, we've seen in other wars that leaders backed by the West have also given the impression that they can't walk away. We saw that in Afghanistan, we saw that in Vietnam, we've seen it in other places too, and of course they themselves did walk away. But anyway, that's a question of sustainability again. And Putin supposedly is, according to Ratman, is able to hold out. He's able to play a waiting game. He's able to build up his forces, go on the attack again in 2024. Well, why does Ratman think that? He doesn't actually say. But I've been discussing in many programs now about how the Russian military-industrial complex is now apparently operating, perhaps not at full capacity, but is gearing up to that, and is able to produce more and more ammunition, tanks, missiles, machines, every kind of weapon system that you can expect. And I've also discussed how the Russian economy seems to be holding up against the pressure, the economic pressure of the sanctions successfully. And there is now an admission about all of this from Germany's intelligence service, the BND. They say that the Russians can sustain the war for years. They don't put a final end point to the date when the Russians can no longer sustain the war, but apparently they can sustain it for years. And there is no sign of any significant challenge to President Putin's government in Russia itself. Russian society has consolidated. There is no significant challenge to Putin, and Prigozhin's comments, his arguments with the leaders of the Russian military don't reflect any cracks in the political system. And I would add, by the way, that Prigozhin himself has been extremely careful at all times to avoid including Putin in his criticisms, and appears to be keen on maintaining some kind of political relationship, or indeed, conceivably, for all I know, even a personal relationship with Putin and the political leaders in Moscow. Whether he's successful in that is an entirely different matter. But anyway, that's what the BND says. They say that there is no prospect of Russia losing the ability to prosecute the war anytime soon, and there is no prospect of a significant political challenge to President Putin, who, by the way, stands for re-election in Russia next year. So, again, a war without end, at best, a war where all the assumptions and calculations that the Western leaders have made have turned out to be false, because the whole presumption, the whole assumption behind the Western response to the events of February 2022 was that Russia would crack quickly, that Russia would run out of money, that the sanctions would cause the Russian economy to collapse, that the ruble would crater, that Russia would be cut off from its export revenues, that its oil and gas export revenues would fold, that in effect the Russian economy, that the Russia would be broken in that kind of way. Except, as I said, that it actually hasn't turned out like that at all. And what we go on to read is that